Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Teofilo Requejo Washed Extended Fermentation Processed Peru from Spectrum Coffees. And there's the box right there. And Spectrum, based out of Brooklyn, New York, and this is their first ever appearance on this channel, and they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. Story's pretty simple. Was walking around town checking some coffee shops, and I noticed their coffees in a couple of different coffee shops. So I figured I'd pick up one of their boxes and try them out. Believe it or not, this was one of their more standard sounding offerings from the coffees that I found, so it definitely appears that Spectrum skews a little bit more on the experimental side of things. So it'll be interesting to see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 28. And Spectrum does have a brew guide on their website. It is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, and they say just off of boil. However, I liked it a little cooler. Standard recipe, 205 degrees Fahrenheit for us, and liked it best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Spectrum roast profile is always really tricky to tell when it comes to these more experimental coffees. I will say this one's lighter than most American coffees. That's kind of the best I can go with for it. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and the coffee had a slight bit of this papery quality to it, and that's something I experience with so many of these washed experimental fermentation processed coffees in general. However, post that, it does have a slight bit of this artificial sugar sweetness that's very much skewing on the tropical side of things. So I really do like that sweetness. So as a result, it left a positive first impression, and there was definitely something to work with here. Day 15, better day the second time around, as it is much sweeter with so many of these sugary fruits, and I believe that they have a mango flavor note listed on here, which is definitely one of the more sugary stone fruits. So I liked that based off of the second impression, as the coffee continues to skew a little bit more towards the tropical fruit sweetness, and I was able to get more of the sweetness when brewed through the V60 on this day. Day 17, continuing to see general improvements to the cup as it continues to come out just a bit sweeter in general, continuing to skew in the sugary fruit direction as well as sugary in general, as in addition to these more sugary fruits, it had this sugary base to it as well, and I was noticing the paper quality kind of dissipating with a little bit more time. Day 19, continuing to see improvements to the cup, especially as it does cool down. Don't necessarily enjoy it the most off brew. There's this great middle ground temperature where the cup really seems to have a fair bit of the more sugary stone fruits, as I've already kind of alluded to. But in addition to that, it does have some complementary South American characteristics to it, including a slight bit of nuttiness that I was definitely able to experience on this day, but pretty generally a tropical fruit forward cup. Day 20, back through the Chemex, and I was noticing consistency across brew methods as well as recipes. This was a pretty consistent coffee, despite the fact that it was one of these more experimental coffees. As the slightly papery taste, it does feel a little bit more pronounced in the Chemex as well. So that's another reason I skewed a little bit more on the V60 for it. The cup is really bright and sharp, otherwise leaving a very lasting acidic finish. And that's something I noticed, was there was a very sharp and bright acidity to this coffee, which not necessarily the biggest fan of the acidity, but I think really taking note of it on this day was something that would play a huge factor in this coffee later. Day 22, seeing overall improvement as the papery taste once again is dissipating, and this again has to be a correlation to the fact that every time I was brewing it with the V60 it was a lot less of that taste in the coffee. It definitely is skewing in the sugary direction once again, continuing to see increases in the sugar sweetness with a tad less of a focus on the fruit as a whole. Day 25, find this cup settling well at these slightly lower temperatures. So as I've kind of mentioned, when it does cool down ever so slightly, just off brew is not ideal, but then letting it cool down too much isn't ideal either, because then that really kind of sharp, bright acidity really does dominate the cup. However, there is also a fair bit of this sugary brown candy component to this coffee as well, which was another nice aspect to it, another added layer of complexity to this coffee, which was something I enjoyed as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, one level 5. So let's go through that one real quick, and it is the acidity at level 5, and it's not quite as pronounced today. I think the main reason I put it all the way up there at that level 5 on this day was because there were times, especially when this coffee cools, that it's really sharp and bright to the point where I justified it being that level 5 mark. Definitely at minimum higher side of level 4, experiencing it once again today, but it is a little bit toned back today. It could have just been that it's had a little bit more time to settle, but there were definitely times I was saying, yeah, this is a pretty acidic cup of coffee in general. Caramel level 4, Yes, definitely mentioned there's a lot of sugary sweetness to it, brown candy sweetness as well. That's one of the better aspects to this cup of coffee, so I definitely like that one being at the level 4. Finish, level 4 has a very lasting finish. This one arguably could be all the way up there at the level 5, just feels a better fit for that 4 mark. Sweetness, that's one of the things I've been discussing the most throughout. While it is a sweeter cup of coffee, it's not overbearingly sweet, it's not overly dominant in this coffee in general, as you're able to get some other factors from it. So I like it there at that level 4 mark, not necessarily justified at the level 5. Citrus fruit, level 4, that's kind of interesting. I think I would put the stone fruit at level 4 and maybe dial back the citrus, but maybe on this day I was experiencing more of the citrus. So I'm going to change this today. Stone fruit level 4, citrus fruit level 3, but definitely both pronounced. I think the berry fruit is also the level 3 because there was kind of a grapey quality I was able to get from this coffee. Saltiness, as alluded to, there's a bit of the nuttiness in it as well. I mean, you're seeing a lot of things in this tasting wheel in general because while I wouldn't say that it's the most versatile coffee, I don't think it has as many aspects as this tasting wheel might indicate. It is skewed in a specific direction in terms of the fruit aspects, but it's a kind of more wild, funky fruit, which is why I'm pointing that cleanliness only at a level 3 mark. Between the combination of the really high acidity, the papery quality, and a slight bit of the funkiness within the fruits themselves, I had to keep the cleanliness a little bit toned down at that level 3 mark, which isn't necessarily going to be the best indicator of a coffee for me. Yeah, this tasting wheel is interesting because this coffee is just a little different. It's a little out there. So there's at least a level 2 for everything because this coffee doesn't necessarily shy away from these more vibrant flavors in general. With the exception of the flopping on the citrus and the stone fruit, I think I actually quite like the way that this tasting wheel looks even today. Maybe tone down the acidity as well today. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I'll be completely honest that acidity was kind of a big detractor for me, in addition to the cleanliness being a little lower than I think I was hoping for and expecting, because otherwise, if maybe the acidity isn't quite as sharp and bright in this coffee, and there's a little bit of the funkiness and the paperiness toned down to this coffee, bumping up the cleanliness to a level 4 and bumping down that acidity to a level 4, I could really see myself enjoying this coffee as it skews on that type of coffee I really enjoy, the more sugary stone fruits, this brown candy sweetness, and the sugary sweetness in general. But those were enough of a detractor for me that I actually, towards the end, wasn't necessarily liking this coffee. I was getting pretty sick of this coffee in general. It's one of those coffees where it's good for a couple of cups, but by the end, it was a little much for me. That's also coming from somebody that very much enjoys the more clean cups of coffee in general. So take that for how you will, just wasn't necessarily my preference. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you do like your more wild out there coffees but still prefer to keep them kind of within a box, I feel like this is a great fit. And that's kind of the impression I had of this coffee going into it was it is a little bit more traditional sounding, but it's definitely still an experimental coffee, so I didn't expect to get the most clean washed components to this coffee, and it definitely delivered on the promise of more sugary aspects to it, as this was a very sugary cup of coffee. But that's just kind of the way that this coffee ended up being, was a little too skewed in some directions and a little lacking in other ones for me. But it's still a great fit for somebody that maybe really enjoys the acidity as well, as I know that's a big plus for a lot of people, not necessarily for me. I think for the most part though, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything else from Spectrum, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it, or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Teofilo Requejo washed extended fermentation processed Peru from Spectrum Coffees. Thank you for watching.